Immigration Nation. But 100 years ago, this wasn't the plan. This meant tough restrictions on immigration, the White Australia policy. But by the 1960s, a new generation questioned the exclusion of our Asian neighbours. To protect White Australia, Prime Minister Menzies sends troops to fight communism in Korea and Malaya. But in 1950, he also signs up to a plan to counter communism in a very different way.
The Colombo Plan was an attempt to create in Southeast Asia and South Asia a bloc against this communist advance.
Extraordinarily, one of the key features of the Colombo Plan means Menzies will resist communism not by keeping Asians out, but by letting them in. University campuses across Australia will be transformed. Not only will Menzies' great plan fail in its key aim, it has ironic and unintended consequences for white Australians. John Menadue leaves his home in rural South Australia and enrolls at Adelaide University in 1953. On his first day, he's told he'll be sharing a room with 3 Malayan students.
I was just stunned. I grew up knowing nothing else but basically white and Caucasian people. We didn't even have Chinese restaurants in the country towns of South Australia. I guess the main view that I had at that time was that Asians were poor people, they were badly educated, and they'd be something of a threat to this country. I found that these Asian students were well educated, spoke extremely good English, and were very pleasant people to know. I could see that white Australia was abhorrent. It was not in Australia's interest, and that we needed to change. And that experience with those Asian students was very much a part of that.
The old guard, Menzies, Corwell, and others of that generation were not persuaded one iota that there was a need for fundamental change. For them it was axiomatic, it couldn't be challenged. It was like a law of nature that you couldn't mix races. If you mixed races, you end up with trouble.
As Prime Minister Menzies and Arthur Calwell go head-to-head in the federal election of 1961, students target the campaign to force their protest against white Australia onto the agenda.
First of all, I think it's just plain unfair that people should be discriminated against just because of their skin colour. I mean, it's immoral. It gets Australia very bad publicity in the eyes of the world.
I think that white Australia is a slap in the face for Asian peoples, and therefore there's no point in making enemies overseas.
But Calwell and Menzies have no time for radicals or change. Neither do many Australians.
Well, I think that they should keep it wide as much as possible.
There are now hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Vietnam, and several hundred boat people have already made it to Darwin.
Vietnamese refugee boat number 48 arrived in Darwin yesterday with 113 people on board. Immigration Department officials have completed preliminary checks on the refugees and are now awaiting a decision on whether they'll be taken to a quarantine station for detailed health and immigration procedures. For the developing countries of Southeast Asia, the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees is an intolerable economic burden. But with a
July 1979, and there are now 400,000 refugees in Southeast Asia looking for a new home. Malcolm Fraser has a momentous decision to make. If he opens the doors, he not only risks the backlash of a deeply fearful nation, he will overturn an ideology that has barred Asians from Australia for more than 70 years.
In my mind, there's no doubt that the decisions made by the Fraser government literally changed the fates of Australia. We had never had such an injection of Asian migrants to the country, not since the gold rush days.
But for the past 30 years, the agenda has still been dominated by stories of unplanned arrivals.
The arrival of the Tasser, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. Has no obligation under international law.
Australians are concerned when they see boats on our horizon, and they want to make sure that the government is actively managing to protect our borders.
Boat people remain one of Australia's great fears.
Although the arrival of unauthorised boats of asylum seekers has always generated extraordinary angst and extraordinary media coverage, the actual numbers coming to Australia have been tiny in absolute terms, on averages, however you want to look at it.
It's still work in progress. But Australia has made a remarkable journey since 1901, when its political leaders passed draconian laws to protect the dream of a white nation. It's taken a century and more of struggle, but the immigration nation we live in today has been achieved against the odds.
We started the century with a massive contradiction. These universal values of freedom and tolerance and fairness, but they're being restricted to whites only and white Brits only. Now, finally, in the last 20, 30 years, we've got these same core Australian values and characteristics, but now they're not being restricted to any one race or sect. Now, anyone from any continent of the world is able to come to Australia and participate in that. And so it's the final realisation of the dream that was begun by a very different set of people with a very different set of ways of seeing the world back in 19...